All right, guys, welcome. Module 4 is on the progressive era. After this unit, you will be prepared to take the first exam. So some guiding questions you should be able to answer when we are done with this unit. What were the main goals of the progressive movement? We'll go over that in a minute. What tactics did they use? So there's one thing, you want to accomplish something that's your goal, but then it's what tactics, what means are you prepared to use to accomplish your goal? How did the progressive movement change the relationship between the American citizens and the federal government? I've asked you similar questions in earlier units. There'll be similar questions in later units. And the progressive era is one example. We'll cover a few others, specifically the New Deal and the Great Society. There are certain periods in American history, this is one of them, where, for better or for worse, that's for you to assess, but objectively speaking, the government gets bigger, more involved in the day-to-day life of American citizens. Whether that's good or bad was, of course, for you to assess, but it is a reality. All right, we can see that in the progressive era. Um, what current events can we describe as continuations of the progressive movement? So there's some stuff that'll come up in this unit. This covers a period of roughly 100 years ago that you might see some similarities today. There are today significant numbers of American politicians who describe themselves as progressive, who still use that label. So the goals. If you look at these goals, um, they're the kind of things that you can't really oppose. Cleaning up politics. Who could be opposed to that, right? Who wants corrupt politics? Nobody wants that. Limiting the power of big business. So we covered big business in the earlier units with the industrial era, and there was a concern among many that businesses were too big and too powerful. Reducing poverty. Again, yeah, sign me up. Who on earth wants to increase poverty? Nobody. The question is, how are you going to do it, and how successful are those attempts? Promoting social justice. If you've heard that term social justice, it's in very heavy rotation in our timeline, especially since 2020. I'm sure you've heard social justice I'm sure you've heard that term in some context relating to current events. On paper, that's hard to argue against. Who could be against justice in society, right? The critique of the framing, though, of social justice, the critique of social justice is that, according to some, and you should assess this, of course, there is no such thing as social justice. There is only individual justice. This is the critique, okay? And social justice might sound great, but when you're talking about social justice, that implies justice throughout society at large with millions and millions of people in different groups, however you define those groups. And that goes against the idea of individual justice. When you start talking about social justice, you start talking about collective justice, which also implies that there is such a thing as collective guilt. And a lot of more conservative types reject the premise and they say, no, 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 we want justice, of course, but on an individual case by case basis, not this broad sweeping thing of social justice. That's the critique. All right, so you should think that through if that makes any sense to you. So in terms of, let's go back to this, cleaning up politics. Here's an example of how they tried to clean up politics. And this is a great example of good intentions that maybe carry some negative unintended consequences. So let's walk through this. The progressives passed civil service laws. The intention was to discourage politicians from appointing unqualified people to important positions. Good intention, right? We don't want unqualified people being appointed to an important position in the government just because they're friends with the governor, let's say, or the president, whatever the case may be, right? That's corrupt. We don't want that. Okay. So there are these laws that according to the textbook, quote, brought stability and consistency to government. How? Since officials did not lose their jobs every time their party lost power. So the civil service law has basically set up this system in the federal government, especially, where people that work in the government, in the agencies, people that work in the FBI, in the Department of Justice, in the State Department, in the Treasury Department, whatever it is, people you've never heard of, they have to pass a test, a civil service test, to make sure they're qualified to do the job. Makes sense, right? And then they're in that job pretty much for their entire working life if they want to stay in that job. In other words, they don't lose their job every time their party lost power. So, for example, every 4 or 8 years, we switch presidents, right? And do we want a system in which, for example, um, a president comes in, let's say a Democrat president comes in and immediately fires every single person working in the entire federal government if they were a Republican or vice versa, right? Um, and the argument for the civil service laws is pretty straightforward. We don't want that kind of turnover, that kind of chaos and instability and inconsistency, to use the language from the text. We don't want every 4 or 8 years when we get a new president to be replacing hundreds of thousands of federal employees. That's chaotic. We want people working in the federal government that are not hired or fired based on their political opinions, okay? And who qualify to do a job and they stay in that job for 25, 30 years and they get really good at that job in theory and they know what they're doing and they can't be um, influenced by politics. So on paper, that probably makes a lot of sense, right? Here's the catch. Here's the unintended consequence of this. What if a president is elected, comes to power, comes to office, and there are significant numbers of people working in the federal government who technically that means they work for the president, okay? The president controls the executive branch. What if there are significant numbers of people working in the FBI, for example, who hate the elected president and who refuse to follow out the orders of the elected president and who spend their time not implementing the policy of the elected president, but trying to fabricate reasons, fraudulent reasons to remove the elected president from office? That wouldn't be good, right? And then in this case, because of the civil service laws, the elected president can't fire these disloyal people who are trying to, remove the duly elected president. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to picture that happening because that happens to President Trump. And you might despise President Trump. That's fantastic. Half the country does. Welcome aboard. That's not the point. The point is, if we have an elected president and we have significant numbers of people in his own government who refuse to follow his orders because they don't like him, is that really what we want to be doing? If you hate Trump, that's fine. Imagine it was done to another president. If you admire President Obama, would you have been okay with President Obama, who was duly elected president, if people in his own government refused to do what he was elected to do? That wouldn't be right, right? That's not our system. And so hopefully you can see the intention here was very straightforward and very reasonable. We don't want to be constantly firing everyone in the government every 4 or 8 years, right? That's chaotic. We don't want people appointed to jobs based on their political loyalties. That's kind of, we don't want that, right? But the downside could be we have huge numbers of people working in the federal government that basically can't be fired, even if they're disloyal or incompetent. And so that's an unintended consequence of a really good intention. So you got to figure out how those things balance out in your opinion. 17th century. So just like, or 17th Amendment rather, just like in the Reconstruction era, we covered, I believe, three amendments to the Constitution, 13, 14, 15. Um, In the progressive era, there were also a cluster of amendments added. We'll go through 3 or 4 more. 17th Amendment required senators to be elected by popular vote rather than appointed by state legislatures. So you might not know this, but for the majority of our history, senators were not elected by voters in their state. They were appointed by the state legislature, by the state House of Representatives, by the state Congress, the state Senate, right? Now, those state officials who appointed the senator, they were elected by the people of that state. But the senators weren't directly elected by the voters. They were kind of indirectly elected. The senators were chosen by people that the voters had chosen to run their state. So the arguments on either side of this, the progressives who got this passed, their argument was very straightforward. This would be more democratic. Fact check, true. It is more democratic by definition if senators are directly elected by the people of the state of Massachusetts, let's say, as opposed to the senators being chosen by uh, the state government of Massachusetts. It's more democratic, and by definition, it is. The argument against it is that if senators are elected directly by the voters, the incentive structure, what's the incentive structure for the senators? Well, they need to get elected. So in our system, that means they need to get people to vote for them. And how do you get people to vote for you? This is the critique, okay? This is the argument against doing what was done. The argument against this was direct election of senators. The argument against it was if senators are elected directly, the incentive structure for people who want to be in the Senate will be to promise voters free stuff. That's how you can get people to vote for you. And the idea is if they're not directly elected, and that's how it was for the majority of our history, the senators need to listen to the state government, but they don't need to listen directly to voters. So the idea was they were a little bit removed from that pressure to give people free stuff. Now, our national debt right now, I lost track. It's close to $40 trillion. You ever wonder how that happens? Well, this is one big reason why that happens. What part of our government is responsible for spending money? The Congress, including the Senate. How do we get 36, $38 trillion in debt? One big reason is politicians, senators, promising people stuff that they don't need to pay for. Make sense? So intention, it's more democratic. Good. Unintended consequence, it encourages people who want to be in the Senate to get power by promising people that they don't need to pay for anything. And now all of a sudden, 100 years later, we're $40 trillion in debt. That's the kind of quick synopsis of the arguments on both sides of that issue. Income tax. In a few minutes, we'll get to when the income tax was added to the Constitution, but for most of our history, the income tax was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court ruled on that. They set that precedent in 1895. They said an income tax is unconstitutional. And 20 years later, as we'll see in a few minutes, that was overturned. That precedent was overturned. We talked in a previous unit about sometimes that happens. The way this precedent was overturned was they actually changed the Constitution. There was an amendment added to the Constitution that said income tax is constitutional. And hey, if it's an amendment added to the Constitution by the states and the people, then that makes it constitutional by definition. It's in the Constitution. So why did the court originally say the income tax is unconstitutional? In the Constitution, it talks about taxes, obviously. And, the government has the power to tax, or else it's not a government. It's just a debating society. So we had taxes, of course. But in the Constitution, when it talks about taxes, it says the taxes have to be direct and apportioned. And the classical understanding of that was direct means you pay taxes directly at the point where you are spending money. Okay. A sales tax is a direct tax. You pay the tax when you spend the money. Property tax is a direct tax. You only pay property tax if you buy a house, right? In other words, you don't pay taxes until you buy something. That's a direct tax. And apportioned was understood to mean the tax has to be the same for everybody. In other words, a sales tax is a direct tax because you pay it only when you spend money. And it's apportioned because in each state, the sales tax, whatever it is, 5%, 8%, it's the same for everybody. The income tax is different in both regards, direct and apportioned. The income tax is not direct. The income tax is you're not spending, you're not paying the tax when you spend money. The income tax says you pay the tax when you earn money. Okay. So that's a big distinction. And it's not apportioned because we'll see in a few minutes, it's progressive, right? There's that word again. And what that means is the more money you make, the higher percentage you pay. So unlike the sales tax, which is, let's say, 7% in the state of Rhode Island, it's 7% for everyone, rich, poor, in the middle. Are you buying a car? Are you buying a pack of gum? Doesn't matter. 7%, period. Income tax is different. You might pay 0% income tax, or you might pay 35% income tax. Depends on how much money you make. So it's different in both those regards. Now, we take this for granted now because all of us have grown up with the income tax as a reality, and you can see the data here that now the income tax is by far the biggest single source of revenue for our government. But keep in mind, for the majority of our history, there was no income tax, and we managed to become the richest country in the world without an income tax. The idea, it's a relatively new idea that when you earn money, you have to pay taxes on that. And it opens up the danger of what a lot of people would call double taxation. You pay taxes when you earn money, and then with the money that you keep after 10, 20% is taken off of whatever, right? You know this, you get a paycheck and you don't get the full amount, the income tax is withheld. Now, with the money that you keep 75, 80, 90% of your money. With the money that you keep, as soon as you start spending that money, what happens? You start paying more taxes. You pay an income tax, and then when you take what income you have left and go buy something, now you're paying sales tax. That's double taxation. You got taxed twice on the same dollar. That used to not be considered legitimate, but now it's the way we do things. So that's the reality. I'll show you how the income tax came into uh, existence in a minute because people voted for it, which might surprise you. Who would vote to have their income taxed? I'll show you the data in a minute, and I think you'll understand how it happened. In terms of limiting the power of big businesses, that was another one of their goals we listed at the beginning. The Hepburn Act was a law that allowed the government to set shipping rates. The idea was that the railroad companies were too big, too powerful, and this was a progressive attempt to limit their power. And it's just a rhetorical question, I guess. In your opinion, I'm sure you can think of companies that, in your opinion, are ripping people off. I'm sure you can name one, right? National Grid, that was easy. Um, the question is it then the government's right and authority to step in and tell those companies, you can't charge more than X amount for this good or service? Maybe, maybe sometimes that's necessary. The overarching question, though, is this is an example of what's called price fixing, of the government setting the price for a good or a service. In this case, they were setting the price for shipping. So the larger question, and I hope someone has walked you through this thought exercise, it's very important that you wrap your head around this. Who decides what something is worth? That's the question, right? Who decides what, in this case, the shipping rate should be? Now, let me walk you through a simple example for you to see how really complex this is, actually. A can of Coke. All right, so ask yourself, what would you pay for a can of Coke? What would you pay? And look, I'm old, I still, in my mind, a can of Coke should cost 50 cents. I haven't had a can of Coke in 15 years. I'm sure they cost, I don't know, $2 probably, whatever it is. Let's say, let's keep it simple. Let's say you would willingly pay $1 for that can of Coke. Okay? If when you make that decision, here's what you're subconsciously calculating. Ready? If you would willingly pay $1 for a can of Coke, that's because in your mind you have concluded that that can of Coke is worth more than $1. You with me? If you would willingly pay $1 for something, it's because in your opinion, you think it might be worth $2. So you'll gladly pay $1 because to you, that's a really good deal, right? If you thought the can of Coke was only worth 50 cents, you would not pay $1, right? So if you willingly will pay $1, it's because you think that that product is worth more than $1. And you would rather have the can of Coke than the dollar. Okay? If you thought it was worth less than $1, you would not part with your dollar. You'd want the dollar more than the can of Coke. Now, in that same very, very simple example, can of Coke, the seller comes to the opposite conclusion as you, the buyer. The seller who willingly sells you the can of Coke for $1 does not think that that can of Coke is worth more than $1. They don't agree with you. If they thought that can of Coke was worth more than $1, they would not sell it to you for $1. They think it's worth less than $1. They would rather have the dollar than the can of Coke. You would rather have the can of Coke than the dollar. I hope you followed that. Do you see how incredibly simple that exchange is from one point of view? Hey, what's up, man? How much for that can of Coke? $1. All right, cool. Here you go. Thanks. Have a nice day. Everyone's happy. It's a 5-second exchange. Boom. That entire exchange is predicated on an incredibly complex set of decisions and assumptions in which the buyer and the seller disagree on the value of the thing. There is no objective agreed upon value. That disagreement is what makes the entire exchange possible and beneficial to both sides. So, given how simple it is to walk into a store and buy a can of Coke, and given the fact that that exchange, as simple as that is based on the reality that there is no agreed upon value to anything, how incredibly complex would it be for the government to somehow come up with an objective, agreed upon value for a thing that all sides would agree with? I hope you see that's an incredibly complex thing and probably impossible. So it sounds simple at first, maybe, and it might sound like a good idea. I regret to inform you, my friends, life is complicated, and that's just one example. All right. Now, a shipping rate is infinitely more complex than a can of soda. There's so many variables in shipping rates. What are we shipping? Is it perishable or non-perishable? Does it need to be refrigerated or not? That will affect the cost. What insurance companies are at play? How many different state lines is this train crossing? Are there different taxes in those different states? What's the temperature? What's the environment like? Is the train going uphill, in which case it needs to burn more fuel, in which case the railroad needs to spend more money to ship it? All of these things go into setting a shipping rate. It's incredibly complex. Should the government have the authority to set the price of anything, in your opinion? And if they do, how are they going to come up with that magic number? It's very, very complex. President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt at the time, issued 51 executive orders creating wildlife refuges and national parks, and that is referred to by the text as the beginning of modern environmentalism. We'll get to some later examples of that later in the course. Um, Again, like so many other things in this unit and in this course, there's different layers that I want you to assess here. Number one, is this a good idea? Most people would say yes. But number two, what's the limiting principle? Where's the line, right? At what point does it stop being a good idea and turn into something intrusive and overburdening? So, wildlife refuges and national parks. The what you see pictured here, this is in the Four Corners area of the U.S., where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado all meet up in Navajo Nation. Beautiful, amazing part of the country. And these are ruins from Native American tribes, the Hopi and the Anasazi in the Southwest U.S. And this is ruins of a town that was built into the side of a cliff by these ancient civilizations. And you don't need to know anything about this. Just look at the photograph. And we all, I think, agree, okay, we're not going to tear this down and build a Walmart, right? No, no one's on board for that. There are certain things that are so valuable, so irreplaceable that we need to protect those things and the environment around it rather than be concerned about, could we build a movie theater here? Right? We all agree, like with in certain cases, but then the question becomes, at what line? Where's the line rather? What's the limiting principle? So wildlife refuges. In the state of Alaska, if you want to look this up, there's something called ANWR, ANWR, Alaska National Wildlife Reserve or Refuge, something to that effect. And Alaska is huge. And this is a huge, huge part of Alaska. It's got to be bigger than the state of Rhode Island, this park, right? It's huge. This is a big, beautiful, untouched piece of land in Alaska that's set aside by the government. And the rule is no one can build, develop, drill, do anything to this land. It's beautiful, it's pristine. There's reindeer, there's caribou, fine. You know what else there is on that land? Um, Billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of oil under that land that could be drilled and could be an enormous benefit to our economy. What do we do with that? Because no offense to the caribou and the reindeer, I got no beef with them, but you know what? $2 gas would be nice. We have it. We have enough gas that if we drill as much as we wanted to, we'd have $2 gas. We're choosing not to do it. Is that a reasonable trade-off? I don't know. But that's the question, right? Certain things are obvious. That what you see pictured in this photograph here, no one wants to tear that down and drill for oil. But if you're setting aside, for example, parts of this of Alaska that are bigger than the state of Rhode Island and saying we can't touch this, even though there's enormous wealth there, is that reasonable to you? That's the question, right? Where's the line? Because we need to preserve our environment and all that other stuff, obviously, but we also need to protect our economy. Here's another Supreme Court case, Mueller versus Oregon. So in Oregon, there was a state law that limited the amount of hours that women could work to 10 hours. And the Supreme Court said that's fine. And they said in the ruling that women are, quote, in a class by themselves and require protections that men do not. Now, I should go without saying that the Supreme Court at the time, this is all men, right? It's 9 men saying women are in a class by themselves and require protections men do not. One of the questions this raised is, what's the goal of the feminist movement, which the first wave feminist movement starts during this period? Um, if the goal of the feminist movement was legal equality, this is not legal equality. It's not saying men can work as many hours as they want and therefore earn as much money as they want, but women can only work 10 hours a day. Therefore, the state of Oregon is effectively limiting how much money women can earn. That's not equality under the law. What's that about? Well, what were the 9 male judges thinking? They're not thinking they're villains, they thinking they're heroes. They're thinking they are defending women. They're saying women are in a class by themselves. They meant that as a compliment. Can also be taken as a condescending, patronizing, infantilizing thing. Women require protections, men don't. You know, they're fragile, right? That's kind of the undercurrent of it, isn't it? Now, the larger, we'll get some more examples of the later feminist movement later on in the course. The larger question here, very, very, very important question for you to consider. This is a timeless issue in our system. Brandeis was the Supreme Court justice who wrote that decision. Women are in a class by themselves. And when a court makes a ruling, the judges on either side, whether they agree or disagree, they write what are called legal briefs. They write um, an assessment, an explanation of why they came to the decision that they came to, and they're supposed to point to specific parts of the Constitution that they think support their decision. And what Brandeis did in that case, the book points out, he talked about on 2 pages of the brief, talked about constitutional issues. I decided women can only work 10 hours a day because I interpreted the 14th Amendment to mean blah, 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 right? But most of what he wrote to justify his decision was based on social science research, not on the Constitution. And the social science of the time, I guarantee you, would shock you and appall you. Okay. I guarantee you there were fancy peer-reviewed social science journals written by men who went to very fancy schools, who had doctorate degrees. I guarantee you they wrote, quote, scientific papers saying that women, if they worked more than 10 hours a day, would have a nervous breakdown because they're mentally fragile. I guarantee you they were writing stuff like that. And that's what this guy is citing. That's one problem. The other problem is, even if the social science is good, well, that's nice. Who cares? We're supposed to be talking about the Constitution, not social science. But the larger issue here, it's constant timeless issue, originalism versus activism. Originalism is the more conservative point of view. And originalism says when we are looking at the Constitution and trying to interpret what it means in the sense of, is this law legit or not? What is the job of the judge? And the originalist conservative view says the job of the judge is to interpret the original language of the Constitution, period. It was written in English. It's a very short document. It's very straightforward. It says what it says. Your job is to read the words in the document and base your decision not on your opinion, not on your feelings, not on what you wish the world looked like, but only on what the Constitution says, period. That's the originalist view. The activist is the more liberal view, and it goes like this. The Constitution is great, but it was written a long time ago in a very different context. And the world and our country has changed since 1787. Yeah, of course it has. And therefore, we need to be a little more active in interpreting those words. We need to be a little more flexible. All right, that's the more kind of liberal approach. And so, like so many other things, I'm going to ask you to consider. Number one, which of these 2 points of view do you generally gravitate towards? Only look at what the words mean specifically, or be a little more open-minded about how you interpret the text because it was written a long time ago and things have changed. Which makes more sense to you? And then below that, every situation is different. So you might be more geared towards activism But on some issues, you might say, yeah, but on that issue, just be an originalist, right? Or vice versa. You could say, I'm generally an originalist, kind of conservative, but on this issue, we need to be a little more activists. You know what I mean? So it's not either or, it's every situation is different. And maybe it's a mix, right? Maybe you're 80% originalist, 20% activist or something. So let me walk you through a couple quick examples to make sure you understand this back and forth. Originalism. Let's talk about guns. The Second Amendment, what does it say? The rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's what it says. Shall not be infringed, period. Very straightforward. So let's say a case comes up in the Supreme Court. There's a state that wants to ban the AR-15, which is a type of rifle I'm sure you've heard of. The originalist judges in this case would say, no. The Second Amendment says the rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Thank you. Have a nice day. Right? Pretty straightforward, just based on the original text. What would an activist say? The activist would say, we know what the Second Amendment says, but when that was written, the rights of the people to keep and bear arms, what kind of arms were available to the people? What kind of weapons were there? Well, there were single shot muskets when that text was written. And the people that wrote that, those are the arms that were in circulation, single shot muskets. And if you really knew how to handle that weapon, you could get off maybe 2 accurate shots in a minute. And the people that wrote that document in the 1780s could not have imagined an AR-15. It's a long gun, just like a musket, but with an AR-15, you're not shooting 2 rounds a minute. You know, you have a 30-round magazine, you could shoot, well, I mean, how many times can you do this in 60 seconds? You could fire 30 rounds in 20 seconds, switch out the magazine, but you could fire 60 rounds in 1 minute, not two. So, right, the technology has changed. Like, what is an arm? Keep and bear arms. What do they mean? Single shot musket or semi-automatic rifle with 30 rounds? It's the subject matter has changed radically over the last 250 years, and it has. But then the question for you is, does that matter to you? Does that mean we reinterpret what they meant, or do we have to stick to, hey, says what it says, shall not be infringed? Next question. It's a tough one, right? Let me give you one more. Freedom of speech, First Amendment. When that was written, what did that mean, speech? Well, it meant talking, stand on the street corner and yell about the government. All right, have fun. No problem. That's covered by the First Amendment. Write a article in a newspaper in the city you live in, and maybe 3,000 people will see it. Does the First Amendment cover the internet? An originalist would say, of course it does. Freedom of speech shall not be abridged, period. An activist might say, well, when they wrote that, they didn't mean the ability to instantly communicate with tens of millions of people on the internet. They meant the right to speak in public or to write a newspaper article. Do you see how someone might make that argument? So this is very complex. Society changes. Duh. What do we do with that? Do we change how we analyze our rules that govern that society, or do we stick with the original language? Very complex issue. It's a similar debate in religion, if you're familiar with that, right? For example, does the Bible mean literally what it says word for word, or is it a series of metaphors? Right? It's kind of a similar argument on that side. This quote from the book: "Decentralized power hampered the creation of national minimum standards for pay." And that's a quote from the text, and it might be subtle, but I pick up on these things because I do this for a living, and that I'm clearly seeing that, this is being framed by the author as a negative thing. It hampered, right, something that should have been done in the opinion of the author. Decentralized power. So the progressive, we talked about this before, and it'll come up constantly in this course, all throughout our history, the balance between the federal government and the state governments. The progressives were big fans of federal power. They were not fans of local state power. And the person who wrote your textbook is a progressive, and you can kind of see that in this quote, like decentralized power, bummer, that prevented a national minimum wage. Now, eventually, there was a national minimum wage instituted about 20 years after this. So that did evolve over time. But this is a constant issue, right? And one argument against instituting a national minimum wage was, well, look at the map. We've talked in different contexts about how wildly diverse this country is on all manner of issues. And here's another one, cost of living. Cost of living. You can say there should be a national minimum wage of X amount, and we do have a national minimum wage now, as you know. Um, but we have wild cost of living disparities across the country. So, uh, blue is cheaper and, red is more expensive. So let's look at, well, what are the most expensive? Hawaii and Alaska are both in the top five. Those are That's because of the geography. Most of what is consumed in Alaska and Hawaii has to be shipped in because of where they are geographically, and that makes the product much more expensive and raises the standard of living. But in the continental US, what are some of the most expensive states? New York, Maryland, California, and some of the least expensive states, Kentucky, South Dakota, Nebraska. If there's a national minimum wage, it's going to have very different impacts depending on where you live. If you let's move on from minimum wage to something much above minimum wage, just to make a point. If I told you someone makes $250,000 a year, you would probably say, "Man, that's really good. That's a lot of money." And it is. I would personally be very excited if I made $250,000 a year. But if I told you that and then said, "Is that person rich?" If you understand the geography and what we're looking at here, you would say, "Well, Professor Klinger, I can't answer that. I need to ask you a follow-up question. Where does this person live?" If you live in California and you make $250,000 a year, you're taking home less than half of that because you're paying a lot of federal income tax, and California has a very high state income tax. So that 250 goes down to, let's say, 125. That's still pretty good, right? But that's 125, not 250. And now you need to pay rent and or mortgage, some of the most expensive rents and mortgage rates in the country. So, and then if you have two, three kids and the gas tax in California is very high, $250,000 in Los Angeles is not what it sounds like. It's like barely middle class. Okay. Now, if you make $250,000 and you live in Arkansas, you're balling. Like you're living very well. All right. So one of the things that delayed the national minimum wage is just what you're looking at here. The regions of the country are so different in terms of cost of living that having one minimum wage for the whole country is not that rational, according to some people. But now we do have a minimum wage. And as you know, let me go back to this for a minute. As I think you know, the national minimum wage now is very low. I think it's 7.25 or something like that. No state can go below that because that's the national minimum wage, but states can go above that. And all of the red states on this map do go above that. In California, the minimum wage is, I don't know, $15, $20 an hour. And then the debate becomes so progressives in California will say we need a $20 an hour minimum wage because it's so expensive to live in California. Yes, it is. Why is it so expensive? Well, conservatives would say because you have a $20 minimum wage. That's one of the reasons California is so expensive. So it's a circular argument, right? Progressives are like, we need a $20 minimum wage because the rent's so high. And then the opposing viewpoints like, well, everything's so expensive in California because you keep raising taxes and minimum wage on everything, and then everyone needs to raise their prices, and then it's just a spiral. So it's in the eye of the beholder, right? But there's a lot more to this debate than it might look like at first. Woodrow Wilson is kind of the president at the peak of the progressive movement. He is a darling of uh, textbook authors and journalists and historians. They tend to love this guy. It's a quote from the book. Wilson possessed to a fault the moral certainty that characterized many elite progressives. Progressives viewed themselves and defined themselves as elite, and they had moral certainty. And moral certainty in life can often be a virtue. You need to know what you stand for. You need to have a clear moral compass. That's all good. But it can also be your downfall. Or if you're morally certain, that's great. What are you certain of, right? What are you morally certain about? So Wilson, he did have moral certainty. The author is correct there. Here is a quote from Woodrow Wilson, not a quote about Woodrow Wilson, written by a Woodrow Wilson fanboy, but from the actual person. Here's what this quote is referencing. This is about 100 years ago, almost exactly, and it's right when motion pictures, feature-length movies first emerged. And the first feature-length motion picture, the first movie to be shown at the White House, was shown by Woodrow Wilson when he was president, and the movie was called Birth of a Nation. And Birth of a Nation was about what we covered in the first module of this course, is about Reconstruction. And it's from the Southern perspective. So in Birth of a Nation, in that movie, it's about Reconstruction. The good guys are the KKK. That's the first movie ever shown at the White House. A movie glamorizing and romanticizing the KKK. Quote from the president, who all the historians love. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. Yeah, they were the good guys, according to President Wilson. So yes, he did have moral certainty. He was morally certain that the Klan were the good guys. So that's nice. 16th Amendment allows for the federal income tax. So it used to be unconstitutional, as I covered earlier, and now this made it constitutional. For an amendment to be passed, it's a very high bar. Three-quarters of the states have to approve of it, and people in those states have to vote yes. Why would people vote on, why would people vote this way? If the government comes to you and says, hey, you know how you take home 100% of your paycheck? Like, yeah, why wouldn't I? Because there was no income tax, right? How would you like for us, the government, to be able to take some of your money out of your paycheck before it's even in your pocket? How would you like for us to tax your income? Why would anybody say yes? You ever think about that? It's weird, right? Here's how this happened. Very, very clever and very telling, okay? The original proposal, this is what people were voting on, okay? Households making more than $4,000 a year, and in 2020 equivalency, that's 105,000. Today, that'd be roughly, let's because of inflation, 120,000. Let's just say 105. The first thing the voters are being told is this new tax, this income tax, only applies to people, to households making more than $105,000 a year. So let me drop to the bottom for a minute. That was at the time less than 5% of households, less than five. So why would people vote for this? The first thing they're told is 95% of you will not be affected by this. This only will affect the 5% of the richest people in the country, which is most likely not you. You see that? Based on what you know now, what percentage of Americans pay income tax now? Is it only 5%? No. No, 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 no. Do you only pay income tax now if you make more than $105,000 a year? No, no. But you see what they did there? It's very clever. And the second thing, so first of all, 95% of you voters, you don't need to worry about this. You don't need to pay this tax. You make less than 4,000 a year. Now the equivalent would be about 120. Doesn't apply to you. Okay. That will make someone more likely to vote for it. Number one, this isn't going to apply to me. I don't need to pay it. And people tend to be generous with other people's money. And number two, it'll only affect the rich and they can afford it. And, it'll be good for society because we can bring in some more money to improve schools and, right? Reasonable. The second thing they said at the time was even if this tax does apply to you, which it probably won't, but even if it does, what's the rate? Between 1 and look, 1%, you don't even notice that, right? What's the top rate? What's the maximum percentage of income that can be taken from you, even if you're the richest person in the entire country? 7%. What's the top rate now? Is it 7? No, it's over 5 times that. So here's how they got people to vote for this. Number one, it almost certainly will not apply to you. Number two, even if it does, it'll be single digits. It'll be a very, very small percentage of your money. So people are like, all right, let's go for that. Now, as you know, over the preceding 100 years, the percentage of households that need to pay this has gone up, 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 and the percentage of income of tax that you need to pay is not between 1 and 7. Now the top rate is 37, 38, something like that. This data here, who pays federal taxes? Who pays income tax? And this is important for you to understand because we have the most progressive income tax system basically in the world. Okay. And if you hear people say the rich need to pay their fair share, very, very common thing for politicians to say. And of course, the question though is what is fair, right? So you need to assess that for yourself, of course, but I want you to understand the situation right now because there's a lot of dishonesty about this. Who pays taxes now? The top 1% richest Americans pay 24% of all the taxes collected. So the rich need to pay their fair share. We are the 99%, tax the 1%. Fine. You need to understand the 1% pays 25% of the taxes already. Should they pay more? I don't know. Make that case, but don't let anyone tell you that rich people don't pay taxes. That's a ridiculous obfuscation. Um, Add those two blue pieces of this pie chart, 24 and 45. Let me simplify this and say that adds up to 70%, right? Adds up to about 70%. The top 20% of the country in terms of income, the 20% richest earners, 20% pay 70% of the taxes. Let's look at those two light green strips. Bottom 20%, second 20%. Add those numbers up, you have less than 5%. The bottom 40% pay 5% of all taxes. The top 20% pay 70% of all the money. The bottom 40% pay statistically almost nothing. When you hear people say tax the rich, that's fantastic. I just want you to know as an objective reality, the rich are already taxed. The rich pay in almost all of the taxes. Could they afford more? I don't know. I'm not rich. I couldn't tell you, but probably. And so should you increase their taxes? I don't know. Sure, make that case, but please don't let anyone tell you that rich people don't pay taxes. It's ridiculous. Um, when you hear people say that income taxes should be cut on the poor people don't pay income tax. How can you cut zero? Bottom 20%. 0.6%. The bottom 20%, that's the poorest 20% of Americans. They pay almost nothing. If they have income tax withheld from their paycheck, they get all of that money back at the end of the year. You understand? And look, you can't get blood from a stone. Poor people shouldn't be paying income taxes. I'm glad that they're not. But please don't let people tell you, oh, people at McDonald's pay more income tax than Elon Musk. It's just come on. You're too smart to fall for that. So we have a very progressive system. The more money you make, the higher percentage you have to pay in. That's already the case. In your opinion, you might think the top 1% should pay even more. Sure, make that case, but understand this is what the data is as of this point, right? The rich already pay the majority of the taxes. And of course, they're the ones with the money, right? Last thing, couple examples of quotes from the book that I want to point out to you because we're talking about the progressive era, and this book was written by a progressive for progressives from a progressive point of view, and that's all good. That's totally fine. I just want to make sure that you develop the ability to recognize that framing, that perspective, right? They say black immigrant and native-born white laborers often viewed one another as enemies or strangers rather than as members of a single class. Black immigrant and native-born white laborers, poor people. Poor people of all different races didn't agree on economic issues, is basically what they're saying. They didn't view themselves as members of a single class. If you're familiar at all with Marxism, we'll get to the communist revolutions later in the course, but if you're familiar at all with Marxism and later with communist theory, this is Marxist language, right? You should view yourself as members of a class. That's how people should identify their class. Are they poor? Are they rich? Are they middle class? That in Marxist thought should be more important than religion, culture, anything else, right? Class, 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 class. That explains why the Socialist Party drew at its peak less than 6% of the US vote. And so I'm picking up a little, that's unfortunate from the author. They think more people should have voted for the Socialist Party. Okay, maybe you agree. That's great. Lack of pressure from a strong, self-conscious working men's party contributed to more limited results in the United States. Limited results of what? What was limited in the United States? Socialism was limited in the United States. Okay, as compared to Europe. Europe was much more left-wing socialistic than the United States. Maybe we should be more socialistic. I don't know. That's for you to decide. But I want you to look at this framing very closely. Lack of pressure from a strong, self-conscious working men's party. That is straight up Marxist rhetoric. Class consciousness. Class, class, class. Working men's, sorry, a working men's party. Self-conscious. According to the author, the working people in this country 120 years ago lacked self-consciousness. And this is very common of elite progressive types, especially who work in colleges and universities. The idea that a college professor who wrote this book, who I'm sure is a good person, but the idea that a college professor who is sitting in an air-conditioned office in the 21st century, getting paid a very good wage to write about history, can sit in judgment of a coal miner who lived in 1890 and say that that person who worked harder than this college professor could possibly come close to imagining, that that coal miner was stupid. He wasn't self-aware. He lacked consciousness. How does this wealthy white liberal sitting in his air-conditioned office in 2018, how do they know that? Because that coal miner in 1885 didn't vote the way that the college professor 130 years later thinks that coal miners should have voted. Do you see how that works? Now, this is very common among certain types, and maybe you've seen examples of this. The idea that people will judge other people who they've never met, whose lives they know nothing about, and sit in judgment and say, I know what this person should think about specific issues. You can see this maybe if you're familiar with any examples of this in US politics more recently, there are certain types of political leaders who will say, of both parties, so and so should automatically vote for Democrats, or so and so should automatically vote for a Republican, right? How could any black person vote for Trump? How could any uh, how could any Jewish person vote for a Democrat? How could any woman vote against Hillary Clinton? How could any Hispanic person vote for a Republican? You ever heard anything like that? That kind of collectivization, I can look at you and say, you're a member of this group, and therefore you should think X, Y, and Z about every certain issue. That's very common in Marxist rhetoric, and it's very common in your own textbook. Um, and it's something that you should think about. And if you've seen that at work at all, think that through, right? In your personal life, how do you identify? What part of your identity is most important to you? Is it your religious affiliation? Is it your cultural background in terms of your parents' country of origin? Is it your political ideas? Is it your class, your income level? Is it your whatever it is, right? We all identify ourselves in different ways. In whatever way that is it reasonable in your opinion to look at a person and say, okay, you're a 45-year-old Catholic man with 3 kids. I know exactly what you think about every political issue under the sun because of how you identify. And if you don't think the way I think you should think, it's because you don't understand your own reality as well as I do, because I'm smart, right? So that can get very condescending, and it can cause people to talk past each other and not even try to understand each other's world's view. Just say, oh, you're poor, and if you don't vote for socialists when you're poor, that must be because you're stupid. That's not helpful. It's not empathetic, but it's very common, unfortunately. All right, so that is it for this unit. You are now ready to take the first exam. You shouldn't have any problems with that. Just take your time with it. Go back through your notes, and that should be a not a heavy lift for you. All right, so thank you, and I will see you next time.